Good evening, everyone. Hi, my name is Lou, and I will be presenting today's webinar. I am in Cape Town, South Africa. It would be wonderful to see where you are. So please say hi in the chat, tell us where you are, and in the meantime, I will tell you a little bit about myself. So I have been a teacher for over 13 long years, and during this time, I have taught students of all ages, all levels, from various countries. It's been wonderful. Never, ever a dull day, and I'm very excited to help you along on your journey. So, as mentioned before, please tell us where you are. Tell us where you're joining from today. Oh, wow, I have Claire from Canada. Welcome. Nice to have you with us. Demi, hello, Demi from South Africa. It's lovely to see you here too, fellow South African. So, please, yes, as you pop in, name, where you're from on the side, and then we'll revisit in a couple of minutes just to see where you're all from today. So, yes, in the meantime, let me just tell you a little bit about what is going to be happening today. We are going to be talking about creating lesson plans for various skill sets, how to structure these, how to get the best out of your students during these lessons. But do note that in the webinar today, we'll be covering just this topic. And if later on in the Q&A section, you have additional questions outside of this topic, please send them to tutor support because we do not want to leave you hanging. We definitely want to answer all the questions you have. But for today, yes, questions will be answered relating to this particular topic. All right. We have a few more visitors here. We've got Debbie from Monaco, but in London today. Wow. Hi, Debbie. And then we have Riza from South Africa too. Nice to have you here. And then we have Mary, also from Canada. Welcome, Mary. Karina from Glasgow. Nice to see you. And also JD from London. It's wonderful to have you all here. So, as mentioned, today's webinar is an interesting one. It really gets into those various lesson plans, not only for the assignments and for the course, but also as you go on to teach. You know, a good lesson plan does wonders for your lesson, and your students know when you are prepared and they appreciate that effort and that preparation that you've put into your lesson because of the lesson plan. So, why don't we get straight into it? All right. So, as mentioned, it's all about lesson planning today. And I know that many of you feel quite excited about this. Yes, because you've got assignments to hand in, but also because a lesson plan just gives you a map for that lesson. Do you know that very much at the beginning of my career as a TEFL teacher, and still now, I often just keep my lesson plan on my desk just to keep me anchored, just to keep me centered. And what I do is, as I teach my lesson, as I walk around a little bit, I come back to my desk, I glance at my lesson plan, and it just helps me, get my head around what's coming next. And I promise you, it will help you too. So that's just a very, very premature early tip. So lesson planning essentially involves thinking about the lesson, writing the plan, creating and sourcing materials for your lesson activities. So lessons usually follow a structure, and the structure makes it easier for teachers to plan. And in most cases, lessons have a warmer, the body of the lesson, which can take various forms, and a plenary. This structure also provides a stable scaffold for the lesson. So when we talk about warmers, I love a warmer because a warmer for me not only engages my learners, but it settles me as a teacher. So the warmer should essentially introduce the topic of the lesson. The body is the main teaching and learning part. I always say that the body is where the teacher is busiest, but the warmer just gives you the opportunity to engage your learners. Um, Unlike the body, where it's all about learning and sharing. And then the plenary offers some sort of consolidation or reflection on the learning content in the body of the lesson. Within the body of the lesson, we can have different lesson structures. This provides the frame or the skeleton on which to hang all the different elements of a lesson. And then finally, the plenary is used to review what has been learned, perhaps through a whole class discussion or a Q&A, pretty much like we'll have at the end of the session today. So the WBP, the Warmer Body Plenary, can describe the structure of any lesson and may incorporate PPP, which is present, practice, produce, and TTT, which is test, teach, test. So as we mentioned, the lesson structure, the body of the lesson can have various structures. As mentioned before, the WBP, Warmer Body Plenary, and the body of a lesson can incorporate two methodologies here today, the PPP, present, practice, produce, or TTT, test, teach, test. All right, so when we think about just going back, something I've forgotten here that I'd like to bring to your attention. The body of the lesson, as we said, PPP, TTT. So when we speak about the PPP structure, the PPP stands for present, practice, produce. And this is one of the most common lesson structures that you'll come across. This is not TEFL Academy methodology. This is TEFL internationally. So any school or organization that you end up working for could very well use this methodology, and part of your engagement or application process, they might ask you to submit a PPP lesson plan or a TTT lesson plan. But we're going to look at the PPP first. So the very first stage, as I mentioned earlier, is present. Now, what is the present for? The present stage is where you give your students the information that they need to manipulate the language. You are basically introducing the target language for the very first time. And this structure can be used for grammar, reading, listening, or even a pronunciation lesson. Then we have practice. Now, during this stage of the lesson, your students essentially do just that. They practice the target language that you've just taught them. And we provide students with controlled practice activities to support the language learning. And the focus here is accuracy. So when your students have now in the present stage learnt these new concepts, these new forms, these new functions, now of course it's time to knuckle down and really get into the form and focus on accuracy. And what we mean by controlled is that you as a teacher, or that worksheet you're giving them, that dictates the outcomes. The answers in a controlled practice, they're either right or wrong. Gapful activities, to formulate jumbled up sentences, controlled practice. I am quite old school here. I like to give my students a worksheet, and I find that this really cements the form they're trying to study, and also gives them something tangible to take home at the end of the day. Now we get to one of my favorite stages, and that is the produce stage of a lesson. During this stage, give your students activities where they are encouraged to produce the language and develop fluency in communicative activities. They need to be allowed some freedom with the target language. You no longer dictate whether the answers are right or wrong. In fact, error correction is dissuaded here. This is where your students now, they've learned this new tense, they've studied it, they've done a worksheet, and now the teacher allocates a topic, they turn to a partner, and they just get to speak, enjoying this new target language that they've just learned and acquired. So let's now look at TTT. The acronym TTT stands for, as we discussed earlier, teach, test, teach. And this is a good lesson structure to choose when you plan to introduce a complex topic or contrast a new concept to one that your students already know, quite common with tenses. So use the TTT structure to find the learner's knowledge gaps while supporting them through the lesson to fill these gaps at the same time. So there are 5 stages to a TTT lesson. If we also include good old warmer at the beginning and the plenary at the end. So now let's take a look at some common features of lesson plans. What do we see when we look at a lesson plan? And again, remember that these things, these concepts are quite universal. TEFL Academy, yes, we teach them to you, but any school organization where you will be teaching one day will most likely, you'll see these aspects of a lesson plan when looking at the document. So common features of lesson plans, lesson details, the class you're teaching. And this often relates to the level of class. We study the CEFR levels extensively in the course, and you'll get a good idea of what they learn at various stages. So this kind of information, yes, pre-intermediate level, elementary level, upper intermediate, advanced, or proficiency level. The date, always good, because what it does is it tells you when last you taught a lesson plan. Can you recycle that lesson plan? If another teacher wants to do a similar lesson, you can actually give them a lesson plan. It just helps you keep track of what you're teaching your learners and when. Also important, the topic of the lesson. What will they be learning? Here's an example. Are they learning adverbs of frequency? Are they learning the present continuous tense? Are they learning modals? So here you would put the grammar topic that your learners will be learning in this particular lesson. That's what that stands for. And then the length of the lesson. Now here's an example, 60 minutes, a very common time frame for lessons. But note that various schools will have different time frames. I worked at a school not too long ago where one lesson was 1 hour and 20 minutes. The learners would get a 10-minute break and come back for another hour and 20 minutes with me. So these time frames, the length of lessons, they vary a little bit from one place to the next. And then also the number of students. An important factor because you want to know how many students you're planning this lesson for. These things are important to remember with things like pair work or group work. Will it be possible to pair them up? Will it be possible to allow them to work in groups? And then also the lesson type. Grammar, is it a grammar lesson? Is it a vocabulary lesson? Is it a reading lesson? This is also important information to put on your lesson plan. All right, so when we look at a lesson plan, or when you start downloading all our lesson plans in our course material, you'll see that on every lesson plan, there is a lesson aim. Now, what's important here is that your aim focuses on the teaching or learning part of the lesson. So ask yourself, what is the new information or skills that students are learning here? Example, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to use frequency adverbs to describe routines. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to use the present continuous to talk about actions happening in the moment. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to use modals like should to give advice to their friend. So again, what is the global thing that you want to achieve with this lesson? Think about it in those terms, and that's your lesson aim. Right, so the next thing is lesson objectives. Now, these are a little bit more tangible. These are the little steps that students take in class to achieve the aims. So think about the aims and think now of your objectives as how those aims will be achieved. And when we decide on our lesson objectives, we need to really look at each objective and ask ourselves, one, is it realistic? Is it measurable? So example, students will use 4 common frequency adverbs to describe their morning routine. Think about what is realistic, because remember, we teachers, we know the target language. We use it daily. We use it proficiently. We use it beautifully. But our learners are still learning and they take a little bit more time. So always remember not to cram too much into a lesson. Think about what is realistic. Think about the students you have and what they're likely to achieve in the lesson. All right, so the next thing is materials and equipment. So an example of this is the technology you'll use in the classroom, the interactive whiteboard. I have nightmares about the interactive whiteboard because when I write on the interactive whiteboard, I write like a 2-year-old. But so be it. I have learned and my writing has improved, but this is part of the materials and equipment that I use in my class. The worksheets you give your students, the flashcards that you give, the imagery you use, that would all form part of materials and equipment. Another thing to consider is anticipated problems. This is something you'll see on a lesson plan too. An example of this is if technology fails. That always seems to happen to me, and I know it'll happen to you occasionally. So think about what sort of backup you have. The minute you think of a potential problem, already think of a potential solution. Will students be able to complete the lesson in the allocated time frame? What added tasks can you prepare for those students who finish early? But then also something that you must not overlook, and that is quite important, is that are the issues that students may have when trying to understand the new form and function. Will they be able to understand that the tense relates to the future, even though there's a present verb in that tense? Will they be able to understand that something that is done in the moment, this tense can also be used for something in the future? Will they be able to form the contraction? For example, I and will creates I'll. Will they have an issue with that? So when it comes to anticipated problems, yes, all the physical technological things scary, but also please think about the issues that your learners might have when trying to understand the new target language. And then solutions. As I said earlier, as soon as you think of a problem, brainstorm a solution. Find solutions online, look in course books, ask fellow teachers. This could happen. What can I do to remedy this? Quite important to get a little bit of input from existing teachers too. All right, so now we're going to look at the lesson stages for different types of lessons. And the first one we're going to look at is a reading lesson. Now, a reading lesson is quite interesting because when I did my TEFL many, many, many years ago, I kept thinking, a reading lesson? Surely they just read something in class. That's what I understand as reading, but no, it's got stages. Those stages are necessary in order for your learners to feel that wonderful feeling of I've achieved something by the end of the lesson. So the very first stage that we have in a reading lesson, yes, here it is again, the warm-up. Now, the warmer should give your learners the opportunity to predict what they think the topic is going to be about. If it's a reading about various markets around the world, you could show them some imagery. You could show them a little video clip. You could show them some things you bought at the market. But the warmer should essentially engage your learners and also allow them to predict the topic of the reading. Think about it this way. When you go into a waiting room. You pick up a magazine, you flip through the magazine, you look at the imagery, you maybe look at the title or the heading, and you make predictions about what you think the rest of the text is about. So give them the same opportunity in a reading lesson. Then the next stage is your pre-teach vocabulary stage. And here, before we even start the lesson, before you plan this lesson, you as the teacher, you go through the text and you select key vocabulary items that would be necessary in order to understand the text. And this is the opportunity to use something called a vocabulary profiler. What I like to do is I like to put the whole text into the vocabulary profiler, and I look at the vocabulary that really stand out and would need to be pre-taught. So aim for items, I would say preferably above the level of your class, because those are the words they are not likely to know yet. Words at their level, it's a bit of a gamble. They might not, depending on frequency of the word or the origin of the word. But that's why it's always a good idea to go for words higher than their level. Right, so let's look at the next stage. So now we've got warmer, we've got pre-teach vocabulary, and we look at the next one. And the very next one is called the first reading task. And here we test the skills of skimming and or scanning. Now, this task should be no more than 3 questions and should ideally test the idea of what is this text about. But we do not give them that question that direct. We give them the question in a roundabout way. Is the writer talking about the past or about their current job? Does the writer still do the job? So think about questions that would tell you as a teacher that they've understood the gist of what they've read. Right, and then the second reading task, well, this is where it gets a bit more intricate. And now you come up with about 7 comprehension questions to test that skill of intensive reading. Comprehension questions should not just have them looking for answers, scanning the text. It should really test whether they understand the deeper meaning in the text. And then finally, again, one of my favorite stages, the follow-on communicative task. Now here, again, you want them to have the opportunity to verbally respond to the text with their thoughts, their ideas, their feelings, and their own experiences. You could do a group discussion, a class discussion. You could do pair work discussion, but give them a few questions, no longer to test understanding of the text, but just to get them to share their own ideas and opinions in relation to the topics in the text. I hope that's clear. All right. So a listening lesson, thankfully, has very, very similar stages to a reading lesson. A listening lesson would again have a warm-up to engage your learners, a pre-teach vocabulary stage to address all those complicated and complex words that they will encounter later on when listening. And then we have the first listening task. Now, the first listening task is where we want to really check that they understand the gist of what they're listening to. So we ask again just a couple of questions, and it needs to tell us as teachers that they understand what's going on in the listening. Is it clear? Do they understand who the speaker is? Do they understand that this listening is a story about someone's life? Do they understand that this is an informative piece? Do they understand that, there are 2 speakers trying to decide on which restaurant to go to? Just the gist, that extensive listening experience. And then our second listening task, well, again, we get really deep here and we test their understanding of real comprehension. So we ask questions that, they're not easy just to pick out the answers, but to actually understand what is going on here. Why does the person speaking feel that way? Now, just a tip before we continue, a little phrase I want to teach you. Task before text, or task before listening. Always give them the questions before they start listening. Why? Because those questions give them a reason for listening. Those questions guide them as they listen. Oh, right, that's the answer to this question. That's the answer to that one. So always give the questions to them just before they start listening. That means first listening questions just before they listen for the first time, and second listening questions just before they listen for the second time. And again, there's a follow-on communicative task. Think about it. They've listened, they've taken in all this information. Now it's time for some output. It's time for some sharing. And that's exactly, again, what the follow-on communicative task can give us. Again, I suggest a small group discussion based on the theme. So if they're listening about someone's life, someone who does a particular job, someone who's traveled a lot, ask them in this task, where would you like to travel? Would you like to travel for your job? Have you ever traveled for your job? Is there any job that you'd like to do? Does it involve a lot of travel? Talk about some of the places you've been to. So as you can see, it no longer tests their understanding of the comprehension or the listening itself, but they get to respond to the listening once again with their thoughts, their views, and their personal experiences. All right, so now we move on to grammar lessons. Now, I love teaching grammar, and the reason I love teaching grammar is again because those stages that I use to plan my lessons give me security as a teacher, and I don't feel shaky and uncertain. And I think that's why I enjoy teaching grammar lessons so much. Your learners really engage in grammar lessons. So once again, hello, there it is, your warmer. Your warmer needs to establish the context of your lesson. Now, if I'm teaching my students the present continuous tense, for example, as a teacher, I should not use the present continuous tense in the warmer. Why? Students do not know the tense at this stage. So to them, they don't understand what I'm saying. Think about it. If you're trying to learn another language and your teacher uses a grammatical structure in speaking in a very early stage of the lesson before you've learnt it, you won't know what that teacher is talking about. Time frame, no more than 5 to 10 minutes. I like to stick to a 5 minute time frame, but some teachers like to extend it to 10 minutes, but please no more. Now, your presentation stage is where you are essentially introducing your target language for the very first time. Again, try not to give away the target language. Don't give them an example. Don't ask them a question using the target language. Just use your context that you used in the warmer to elicit the example sentence. And then you elicit the form and you concept check the function, which brings us to the next point. MFP must be covered. M, meaning. Meaning is also called function. F is for form, the structure, the subject, the verb. Is it a verb with ed? Is it a verb with ing? Is there an auxiliary in the structure? And then P for pronunciation. And believe it or not, pronunciation is vital in a grammar lesson too. If they're learning the future simple, I will, she will, they will, they'll need to know when pronouncing the sentence, they can also contract I and will and create I'll. So those are little pronunciation aspects that you'd have to deal with in the classroom. And then when we think about the present stage, we think in terms of 15 to 20 minutes. This is where you are at your busiest as a teacher in a grammar lesson. Then we have the practice stage. The practice stage, if you remember, we mentioned this a little bit earlier, is your accuracy-based task, your gap fill, your unscrambling task, your matching task. And again, let them knuckle down with something really controlled, something you can check as a class and something they can take home and use in revision or as a basis for homework. And then again, production stage, here are your freer speaking tasks to develop fluency. Give them a topic, have them converse, give them a role play, have them converse that way, give them a simulation task, pretend they're at a press conference. There are so many ideas. Check our course material, plenty of fluency-based tasks. And then the plenary, 5 to 10 minutes, really should be a review of the lesson, could be a whole class discussion, could be Q&A, a reflection task, a teach your partner task, 5 to 10 minutes. So again, timing, warmer 5 to 10 minutes, presentation 15 to 20 minutes, practice stage 15 minutes, production stage no more than 20 minutes, and your plenary right at the end, 5 to 10 minutes. And that's your grammar lesson in a nutshell. All right, so now we've got functional language lessons, your everyday English. And I think back to one I taught a while ago, and it was to teach the modal should for giving advice to your neighbor. So again, guess what? The warmer. Establish the context, have a role play, tell them a little anecdote, show them a few images, but remember not to use the target language in the warmer. Avoid it at all costs because they do not know at this very early stage what it means. Then we have the presentation stage. And here you want to elicit an example sentence from them. So can you see why your context in the warmer needs to be quite strong? So you elicit the example sentence in the presentation stage, elicit the form of that sentence to establish the MFP. Concept check for understanding of the function, of the meaning behind that sentence. And then again, practice stage, some accuracy-based tasks. Me, I like those worksheets. You could try something else, but it needs to be something that is very clear. It's right or it's wrong. And they need to have security in that. Something that simple also simplifies the whole stage because you can check this as a class or they can check it in pairs. Then we have the production stage, which is your freer practice. And again, this is to develop fluency. So give them a few topics and allow them to speak. Plenary, a review right at the end, a class discussion, Q&A, and again, 5 to 10 minutes. I'll give you an example of a functional language lesson. As mentioned earlier, I was teaching my students I should do, I shouldn't do, to give advice to someone. So in the warmer, I gave them a little problem. I said, my neighbor has a very noisy dog that wakes me up at all hours of the morning. What can I do? Give me some ideas. I put them in pairs, and for 2-3 minutes, they had to talk about ideas to help poor, tired teacher. We got some feedback. Then I took one of their ideas. The student said, teacher, you talk to your neighbor. And I said, that's a great idea. I'm going to write that sentence down. You, gap, talk to your neighbor. And then I asked my class, so what word can I put in there to say that this is a good idea? And I tried to elicit the word should. Then I asked a few concept questions, checked the form, and off we went to our practice stage, which was a gap fill. Production stage, I now told them to write down a problem they have, give it to the partner, and the partner had to give them some advice to remedy their problem. Plenary, again, we had a class discussion on what we found easy, what we found difficult, when to use should, when not to use should, and there we go. The lesson was done. And the students knew by the time they left the classroom how to tell people or to give people advice using should and shouldn't. Just an example that helped me out quite a lot. All right, so some other lesson plan elements that you will find also in the lesson plan is interaction. You'll see one of the columns in the lesson plan, interaction. Now, the interaction is who is interacting with whom at that particular stage or during that particular task. T to C, teacher to class. Quite a normal interaction for when we're giving instructions. T to S, teacher to student. S to S, students to students. Pair work, group work. Some people just consolidate and write that in the interaction column, and that's fine too. The lesson plan must include inclusion and differentiation. So when we're talking about that, what we're referring to here, inclusion, is to ensure that all students, regardless of their ability or additional learning needs, have access to learning. It's important to create an inclusive learning environment in order to accommodate and meet the learning needs of your students, to allow students to reach their goals and realize their potential, and to allow students to feel valued and included. Differentiation, just a matter of seeing how they learn, different learning styles, different learning abilities, and what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy. All very helpful tips to help you as a teacher. So as mentioned, inclusion, make sure that regardless of ability or learning needs, they all have access to learning and that you can effectively help them to reach that goal. And then as mentioned earlier, differentiation. This is how you as a teacher can support your students with different learning needs. Design lessons based on their learning styles, visual, auditory, reading, kinesthetic learners. So take that into consideration. In my class, I'm looking at my students and I'm thinking, well, I've got a little bit of everything. So make sure that your lessons include a little bit of everything if you can. All right. And then also make sure that you include things like shared interests, topics that they're interested in. I very often find that a needs analysis is quite helpful at the beginning of my learning journey with a particular class. Assess their learning using formative assessment. Find little ways to test their abilities outside of just summative work, like an exam, for example. Formative assessment, little ways of testing their abilities, their progress outside of just exam structure. So research a few of those because they will certainly help you in the classroom. And then also manage your classroom to create a safe and supportive environment. I find that my students learn when they're comfortable and when they're happy. I'm that way. I learn when I'm happy. I learn when I'm comfortable. Your students are no different. And then giving feedback, and feedback that isn't simply focused on error correction, but about the creation of a safe space where students can grow. I like to use a bit of a sandwich method. I would tell students about something wonderful they've done, and I mean it usually because it is. It's wonderful to watch their growth. So, something good they've done, something that needs a little bit of work, something wonderful they've done, something that needs a little bit of work. This I find creates a friendlier atmosphere, and students are more open to the constructive criticism because you've also told them what they're amazing at. And I think we all need that as human beings. So when we teach, we've got the lesson plan. This is your roadmap, but you fill it with yourself, you fill it with your personality, and you also take into consideration what your students need in that lesson. And that's it for the day. I wish you all the best with your lesson planning. It's not always easy, but it's a wonderful process. When I mark assignments, something I regularly read is that it was daunting at the beginning, it was overwhelming at the beginning, but very often I get a comment at the end where students are saying, it was a wonderful experience. It was a great experience. I got to really think about my own creativity, what I would like as a student. And that's quite important as well when planning your lessons. Think about what you would appreciate, think about what you would enjoy, and what you would like, what would make you learn in a lesson, because that is very much in relation to how your students are feeling. All right, so can you believe it? It's time for Q&A, where you get to ask me questions about today's topic, and I get to answer as many as I can in the remaining time. And in the interim, and yes, please type your questions in the chat function. I will be able to answer them, I'll be able to see them. And if I've not answered your question correctly, please retype or just clarify what you're asking me, and I'll be happy, more than happy, to get to your questions before our time runs out today. All right. And then also in the interim, I see a few more people joined after we welcomed all of you. I see Danielle, sorry, Danielle from South Africa, and then Renata from South Africa too. Welcome. JD, happy to see you all got sorted with your internet connection. Nice to have you all here today. So please ask a few questions and I'll be more than happy to answer. Also, if there was a part of the webinar that was a little bit confusing, or maybe I went through it a little bit too quickly, you can certainly ask me about that, and I will happily go over that section again or clarify anything that is a bit difficult. It's not a problem. What you've got to remember is that our course has been designed for people who have not taught before, who have not been in the classroom in the context of teacher. So a lot of these concepts are brand new. So if you ask questions, they're not silly questions at all. They're valid. So please put them in the chat and I'll get to as many of them as I can. All right, so I've got a question from Mary. Let me just put that up on the board for everybody to see. Could you explain VARK once again? Happily, Mary. So when we teach, when we teach, you've got learners with different styles. You've got learners with different learning abilities, and the VARK model includes visual, so that's V for visual, learners that learn visually. That's me. Show me imagery, show me color, attach an image to a concept, and I'm going to remember it. Auditory learners, learners who learn through what they hear. My son is an auditory learner. He likes to listen to things through music. He learns through repetition. And then you've got reading and writing. And then you've also got kinesthetic. Now, kinesthetic learners are those learners who learn through movement. They learn through tangible experiences, tactile experiences. So that's the VARK model. We do touch on it in the course material, but also there is so much information online. And I will tell you that as a teacher, it was important for me to get familiar with this too, because walking into a classroom, yes, you've got all these different learning styles all in one space. And it's a wonderful thing, but it does take a little bit of work planning a lesson that maybe incorporates a few of these learning styles or focuses on one because maybe all your learners are, a certain way inclined. So, Mary, I hope that's helped. All right. Mary, thank you for your question. Are there any more questions? You're welcome. You're absolutely welcome. I know that lesson planning can be a bit daunting, and especially, what really did my head in sometimes when I did my TEFL were all these acronyms, PPP, TTT. So I find that, it is a little bit overwhelming, but take your time with these concepts because they really are interesting and they help you develop as a teacher. All right, let's see. So this is a very good question because a lot of my teaching is done online. Are there specific challenges, using the VARK model if teaching through a webinar? Not at all. I find that, you can find visual. You've got a wealth of visual tools to use online, and then auditory again, sound clips and other helpful exercises to do. Then you've got reading and writing. So I haven't found any challenges there. Yes, the kinesthetic. Okay, I can see where this could pose a challenge because your kinesthetic learners like to move. But I find that with young learners, I use something called total physical response. So instead of having them just shout out answers at me, I would say, right, if you think the answer is A, put your hand on your head. If the answer is B, touch your nose. If the answer is C, pull a funny face. And I would ask the questions and have them respond like this. So again, it gives that opportunity to move. Also show and tell, bring something in, use it, explain something to the rest of the class. So there are other ways to get around this because for me, yes, the kinesthetic element was probably the most difficult to incorporate into an online class, but I found ways of getting around it as long as they can move throughout the lesson or at intervals throughout the lesson. This helps a lot. My son was learning online. He was doing online schooling for a while, and I saw that the teacher definitely included some of these movement challenges into the class. And I kept thinking, I wonder if it was because she's got many kinesthetic learners or just because kids like movement. I find that with adults, again, maybe a slightly different approach instead of touching your nose and pulling funny faces. But again, give them the opportunity to move, to stretch a little bit. If you're teaching prepositions of place, for example, tell them to show you on top or on something, under something, next to something. And again, it makes the class a lot more physical, despite the fact that it is online. And the feedback that I get there, Claire, is that yes, the lesson, despite the fact that it was online, it was interactive and quite physical. And that's what I like to hear at the end of the process. I hope that's helped. I always tell teachers that when you teach online, you pretty much mirror a classroom situation. Yes, there are some great there are some great activities that you could include that involve technology, yes. But at the end of the day, you've still got your warmer, you've still got your body, and you've still got your plenary. You'll still have visual learners, auditory learners, kinesthetic learners in your classroom. So the same rules apply. We have another question. Follow-up activities are to get students to use the target language again and to make sure that they have really understood right. Yes, and I would say yes and yes, but there's an extra element here. The follow-up activity should give them some freedom with the target language. It should give them the ability to speak to someone about a topic. I like to relate the topic in my follow-up activity to the topic of the lesson or the topic of my warm-up. And I would say to them, right, so with your partner, talk about the weekend. Talk about what you want to do. Tell them things you will do, things you won't do, to use the target language. If the target language is should or shouldn't, right, look at all the problems on the page or on the board. Let's discuss what we can do to fix these problems and then put them in groups. So you're not monitoring accuracy. You're not going to correct them. You're just going to allow them to speak here. So Daniil, of course, you're going to maybe secretly write down the mistakes. I do that, but I don't correct on the spot. I would step back and say, okay, student used incorrect modal, student used incorrect tense, student forgot to use will. So I would focus mostly on the target language, not on various other mistakes that mistakes they've made with the target language. And then during the plenary, I would have a correction spot. But it really, really needs to give them some freedom with the target language. What we find on the course is that many people submit follow-on activities and they're not really all that free. It's still very structured. Students don't have a lot of room for movement with the target language. It's either right or wrong. Then it needs to be loosened up a little bit. So like I said earlier, conversation, but you allocate a topic. Role play, again, you allocate the topic and the roles, or you give them the roles, but they're not to tell each other what their roles are, and just to ask questions until they figure out who you are, who I am. Simulation tasks and so on. Quite free within topic and within context of your lesson. Set the task up so that they will naturally use the target language in speaking. This is what makes the task really freer and what makes a good follow-up activity. All right. And yes, Helen, that's exactly. We've got visual, we've got auditory, we've got read/write, and then we've got kinesthetic. Yes. Okay, and then I've got another question here. I'm going to present this on the board. Thank you for the presentation. JD, you're very welcome. Would you recommend any particular order for the lessons? Should we begin with reading, then listening, then grammar, then functional? JD, I need you to clarify that a little bit for me. Do you mean, if you're teaching a class, do you order the lessons in that particular sequence, or are you talking about on the course? Excuse me. I just need a little bit of background information there so that I can better answer that question for you. If I'm going to answer, assuming you mean when teaching a class. So there's no right and wrong order there. Look, I wouldn't start with a listening lesson, for example. I wouldn't start maybe with a grammar lesson right at the beginning of the week. I would start maybe with a little bit of vocabulary, grammar. It would lead into a reading, then a listening. So it just depends on what you want to achieve by the end of the week. There's no particular order for these lessons. I think as a teacher, you can gauge what to start with, what would be a bit simpler for your students, but also what is more necessary by the end of the week. Are they writing a test? Are they going to be writing a grammar test? So you would be able to sequence that. Also, JD, many course books will tell you. So maybe on day one, they would give them a light reading with some vocabulary that they're going to learn. Then day two, they would look at some of the grammar structures in the reading from the day before. And then they would look at some functional everyday English. And by the end of the lesson, yes, maybe there'll be a writing task that they have to do. So it just depends a little bit from, one course book to the next, but you'll get a bit of guidance on that when opening up any particular course book. All right. But JD, if I've not answered your question, please, please, please do clarify, and I'll be more than happy to jump right back in. All right. Danielle, I'm happy that I've answered your question too. And then Alicia, oh, you're very welcome. I know that, lesson planning, again, overwhelming. So happy to know that the video has helped you a lot. Very, very good to know. All right. Any other questions? Please type them in the chat function. We still have a little bit of time, so get them in there. And also, if you're like me, 3 a.m., and you remember a question that you wanted to ask during the webinar, please do send them to tutor support, and we'll be more than happy to help you, to clarify, to eradicate any doubts that you may have. All right. Okay, so Claire's got a very good question. Claire's asked me, have you reused lesson plans in different settings and countries? The answer is yes, yes, and very much yes. As a teacher, Claire, you start developing lesson plans, and I will give you a tip: throw nothing away. Hoard those lesson plans, file them away, because you can easily just tweak the context. If, for example, you used a context in Germany, and that context doesn't really work as well in another country, for example, because maybe the topic is not as hot or not as interesting for those students. Of course, all you need to do is tweak the context, but your lesson plan is there. So absolutely reuse those lesson plans. I also know that a lot of teachers at various schools that I've been to, they write a lesson plan and it works, and they put it into a nice general file, but they would just make a little note saying which classes they've used it for, what level, and on which date. Can you see why that date is so important? And then other teachers can take the lesson plans and tweak them a little bit and use some of the ideas. That's how you learn also. Just don't do that on the assignments. But as you go forward, yes, please. Absolutely reuse your lesson plans. And sharing is caring once you've completed the assignments, of course. All right, JD, happy to hear that I've answered your question, but please do ask if anything else is unclear. All right. Any other questions? We have a couple of minutes left, and I'm here now. Make use of me, ask me those questions. All right, I'm happy. Mary, yes, you're very welcome. Absolutely. As mentioned, I know these concepts are new and slightly overwhelming, so please ask questions. And just another reminder, send your questions to tutor support if you remember something a little bit later on that you wanted to ask. Our tutor support managers are more than happy to help you. All right, any other questions? A question that I got on tutor support that I would like to actually address here is, someone asked me, wow, these lesson plans are really intricate to plan. It took me an hour, 3 hours, or 2 days to plan it. Will we have to plan lessons for every single lesson that we teach going forward? So the answer is not necessarily. I also found that, wow, I thought, my lesson plan would take a day to prepare. And would I have to do the same in, going forward? The answer is no. Lesson plans are usually requested, formal lesson plans. Outside of our course, they are usually requested when you're applying for a job. Sometimes they'll give you a target language, they'll give you a class demographic, and they'll say to you, could you please plan a mock lesson? So that's one instance. Another time that they might ask you for a lesson plan is if you're being observed on the job. So this is something that is regularly done at schools, where we observe teachers teaching, and then obviously we'd ask for a lesson plan so that we can follow along as you teach. That's another time you might be asked for a lesson plan. That's not to say that you might not end up working for a school where they do demand a lesson plan for every single lesson, but it's not likely. So as long as you have a rough idea of what you want to do, write down everything that you feel is useful. No, you do not necessarily have to plan a lesson for a lesson plan for every single lesson. But every teacher needs a plan up here and a rough sketch of what you want to do. All right. And then also, let's see, do you have any classroom management tips? That was Demi's question. Do you have any classroom management tips? Okay, Demi, I don't know where to start here because it's an interesting question because a classroom is just this living organism with so many people and backgrounds and moods and feelings and learning styles. So I think what you've got to remember is that you are the manager of your classroom as a teacher. Your students will try to make little suggestions and hear them. Say to them, great suggestion. Let's try that tomorrow. For today, we do it like this. Also, Demi, something I can definitely recommend, and write this down if you don't write down anything else today, is a classroom contract. A classroom contract is something that you can draw up with your students before you start teaching them. Spend half the lesson doing it, spend 10 minutes doing it, depending, and say to them, right, in groups, come up with a few rules that would make you feel heard, safe, and secure in this classroom. As a teacher, you come up with a few as well. After the lesson, send them home. Take those rules that they've written, make sure you choose at least one from every group, and then you create a classroom contract. Print it, stick it up on the wall, and this helps a lot with classroom management because Demi, if they've been part of the process of making these rules, they're more likely to adhere to them and stick by them. This helps me a lot. So when it's a student just tries to go slightly off the rails, I just nicely point at the classroom contract and it's all done. No negotiations. This has helped me a lot. So please take a look on our course for classroom management tips. But if I can give you something valuable today, Demi, classroom contract. All right. I hope that helps. All right. So is this lesson the first recorded part of the course? Helen, is this lesson the first recorded part of the course? I'm going to need you to clarify that for me, please, and then I'll happily answer. All right. I've got another question here. What are the most common mistakes that new teachers make with their lesson plans? So I can only tell you what I've done. On your lesson plan, there is a column for interaction. Now, the interaction patterns really should vary quite a bit. Mine in the beginning were teacher, class, teacher, class, teacher, class. And that made my lesson very teacher focused, when in fact, your lesson should be student focused. And I actually feel that the more student focused your lesson is, the more they have that ability to go outside, leaving the parameters of the classroom and using the target language the way they should. So, tip, vary those interaction patterns. Also, have a little bit of flexibility with your timing. You have this time frame, you could finish a little sooner, you could take a little bit longer. Be kind to yourself when it comes to timing. Definitely two mistakes I used to make. And then also, Mary, I very often let my students run away with the topic and they get so into the warmer and they start chatting. And when you look at your time, it's gone quarter of an hour or 20 minutes, and no warmer should ever be 20 minutes long. So that is a mistake I make. So that's not only with the planning process, but the execution too. Those are some issues that I've encountered personally. And when I observe teachers, those are some of the issues I see too. Another thing is with the lesson plan, Mary, stick to the target language. Introduce something in the warmer that sets your context for that target language. In the presentation stage, focus only on that target language. In your practice stage, allow them to only practice that target language. Produce stage, allow them to freely practice. Guess what? The target language of the day. Try not to go off topic when it comes to your target language. It will confuse your students, and those students that are not quite ready to go over or to go outside the parameters of the lesson, it might be too overwhelming for them. So stick to the content. All right. Okay, so I'm sorry, but I think we've run out of time. If I have not answered, okay, Helen, I see. Okay, Helen, thank you for clarifying. What I mean is, does this video form part of the course? Not this actual video, but Helen, there are tons of videos and explanations and beautiful visuals on the course that really make the lesson planning process so clear. So not this webinar itself, but yes, there are lesson plan videos embedded in the course. So watch them and watch them again. They are super helpful. And please, Helen, if anything in the video is unclear or you feel a little doubtful, please send us a message on tutor support and we'll happily clarify. All right. Frida, you're very welcome. And then Debbie, I've got a question from Debbie. This is my first lesson, work with the TEFL Academy. Okay, I assume that we have to do the online modules in order, and these weekly video sessions are a complement to that. Okay, so yes, Debbie, the course runs in order, all your units, unit 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And then, yes, you have access to the videos within those units. These webinars, yes, they are weekly, they are free, and you're welcome to join them. If you miss them or you just like to rewatch them, they're available because they've been recorded. All right. I'm very happy for all these questions because I do understand they make your life a little bit easier just to know what to do next. So Mary, yes, you're absolutely welcome. All right, so if there are no other questions, then we move on. All right, so I'd like to thank you. Thank you so much for attending today. It's been lovely having you all, various parts of the world, always very exciting for us as tutors. So please keep tuning in for these webinars. Tell other students because we do like to answer your questions. We like to get your input. All right, so that's it from me. And the very next thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to fill in the survey. Very important because part of the survey is telling us what you like about the webinar and maybe giving us a few ideas of topics that you'd like to see covered. I'm also putting the survey in the chat function, so please save it in your browser and do it if you do have some time. All right, so I wish you all well with your assignments, with your teaching careers. Tune in for our webinars and we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.